Hello, Facebook. Hello, everybody here. Welcome to Free Market Roadshow, Vienna edition. Our host is in Vienna. This event is organized by Austrian Economic Center and the Hayek Institute. And myself, I am from Centrum Kapitalizmu, the young NGO from Poland. And tonight, my guest is the guy who probably I don't have to introduce you to. You already probably met him or you already Googled who is this our VIP tonight. He was all over in libertarian movement. Jeffrey Tucker is an American economist, currently chief editor of American Institute of Economic Research. Is that right, Jeffrey? Hello.
That's correct, yes. Editorial director, yes. Which is to say I'm just a worker peasant who publishes articles mostly by other people, and sometimes I get time to write one. That's basically
you write quite a lot, and I really enjoy your very easy to consume style of writing. and this is the guy who is one of the most popular publishers of soft language about libertarianism, about anarcho-capitalism, and also Bitcoin. Do you think actually, my personal question before we start, should we buy Bitcoin now before halving?
Oh, buy Bitcoin?
Yes.
Well, you know, I will say something about Bitcoin. I haven't really written about it that much in the last year because I kind of ran out of things to say. I wrote a whole book and like 1,000 essays and I couldn't say anymore. But I will say this, during the lockdowns, Bitcoin never locked down. Its code never changed. Bitcoin just continued to be Bitcoin as if there was no pandemic, no lockdowns, no politics, nothing. It just continued on. So I think that's a very interesting thing to consider. It didn't adopt a new level of inflation. Bitcoin didn't bail out anybody. You know, it wasn't managed by the politicians. So Bitcoin just keeps being Bitcoin. And I don't mean to just isolate BTC. I like all these tokens. That whole sector has performed magnificently. It's proof that it's impervious to lockdowns. And I think that's something you should think about as we think about money of the future.
I hope so. I saw this tweet from you recently about this Bitcoin being anti-lockdown thing.
Yeah.
How much time do you have for us tonight, Jeffrey?
Well, I have a bit of time. I've left aside some time. So you can just start asking me questions, or if you'd like to give me some time to give a quick talk, and then I can.
Yeah, from what I heard, you have prepared something for us.
Oh, I never prepare. I never prepare anything. But
you're a good improviser.
I haven't prepared anything in 20 years, but I will.
So let's do it this way. We'll give you a microphone for like 20 minutes. Is that fine? And in that time, people, all our attendees, which we have 50 right now on Zoom and probably 10 or hundreds times more on Facebook. You can guys chat, you can ask your questions either here or on Facebook, and you can also click raise hand. So when there will be time for questions, I will be trying to be quite strict on moderating those so we don't have too much mess here. But if you raise your hand, if you post your question on Zoom or on Facebook, then you are sure that I will consider this to be asked or even to get you on voice. Mr. Tucker, what could you tell us about society during pandemic? How does it change? Do you think the long-term impacts of this all corona crisis is detrimental to our society? Or maybe this is some kind of disruption which we can use to our advantage, to advantage of our cause of liberty? You have 20 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. This is the essence of the core of the issue, and my answer is I think that we're going to come out of this with a great deal of knowledge we didn't have before, and I seriously doubt that within our lifetimes we'll see another government lockdown like we saw, which we stumbled into almost inadvertently, almost like is an apocalyptic test of the state's power. What can they get away with? What can they do? How much power does the media have to cheer on the politicians, and what are people willing to put up with? And I think the results of this have been basically catastrophic for the world economy, and I doubt very seriously that anybody's going to go back. I don't think there's going to be a chance of a re-lockdown in any country in the world after this. I think we've learned I think we're rediscovering is things like human rights, humans' freedoms, and the capacity of freedom to manage a crisis better than the state. And I think that's what's going on right now. We live right now in a very interesting time. I mean, like today, because you see states opening up, right? So Austria is opening up, and in the United States, we have various states of opening up. Right now in Atlanta, Georgia, my friends in Atlanta tell me that the malls are full. Today was the first opening of one of the biggest malls in Atlanta, and it opened at 9 a.m. And from 7 a.m., the entire parking lot was full with people just waiting to get in. So people can't wait to re-embrace their freedom and to live lives as they've lived before. So I think we're going to bounce back from this actually really quickly. And I think it's going to teach us a lesson that we can never do this again. I would like to roll back just slightly to January 27th. And we had already known in the United States, in any case, for several weeks about this Wuhan virus in China. And I knew for sure that it was coming here. Now, a lot of people didn't understand that because they think somehow that viruses obey borders, which they do not. Nor do they obey politicians, nor do they obey any laws. Viruses are going to do what viruses do. And I warned in January 27th that was coming, and that the government would attempt to use the quarantine power. Now, I didn't anticipate that they would attempt to quarantine both the sick and the well. In other words, put everybody on the whole planet under house arrest, with the exception of Japan, South Korea, and Sweden, and a few other states. But I did predict that they would attempt to use these powers, which had been, at least in the US, been contemplated since about 2005. And I made the argument that this was a bad idea, that a free society can handle disease mitigation better than a society ruled by politicians, because we leave disease mitigation to medical professionals and to individual choice. People don't like to be sick, and they don't like to get other people sick. Now, if you understand that basic principle, then you can understand how things tend to flesh themselves out. Vulnerable populations, which generally know who they are, tend to isolate. And then populations for whom the disease is not serious tend to go about their lives. Schools stay open, restaurants stay open, bars open. I've written a couple of articles recently about 1968 pandemic. Woodstock took place. There wasn't a single closure in 1957. There wasn't a single closure of anything with the exception of the Latter-day Saints National Convention, as far as I know. So thank you, Mark Skousen, for pointing that out to me. I think it's a very interesting observation because it's not as if they were ignorant. They knew in 1968 and 1957 that there was a pandemic on the loose. Both of these pandemics killed 100,000 and 116,000 Americans, respectively, in a time when the population was a third less or even half less than it is today, and when people lived far less long, a lifespan of 68 instead of 79. So you had far fewer vulnerable people that were at risk for fatalities from this disease. And yet there was a lot of death. And so they were very, very serious, and people knew it, but they had a different attitude. The attitude was, politics can't control viruses. Let's leave this to the medical industry and the medical professionals. And let's deal with viruses as a terrible thing that exists, but if we can obtain them, conquer them, achieve something like community immunity from them, then we can get stronger as a result and we can deal with the next one. So that's not what happened in this case. I think the problem, I'm not sure if I can't speak to the European case, but at least in America, people were in fantastic denial of this virus, like as if it was just a Chinese thing and it would never get here. I mean, it's like astonishing in retrospect. So the very first thing that happened was that the Center for Disease Control refused to distribute tests for the viruses from the World Health Organization, forbid private labs from developing their own tests. They were just imposing regulations, and then developed their own test, which was faulty. And by the time the private labs figured it out, CDC had withdrawn that test. So that's the actual history of what happened. So by the time it actually got here, and we don't know when it got here. I think it's, experts tell us that it was probably here in January already. And so it probably swept through New York and Massachusetts in February. Like I say, I wrote my first article on it January 27th. As far as I know, I'm the first person to actually discuss this disease in light of the theory of a free society, at least this year. But as far as we know, the virus is circulating already then. And by about this first or second week of March, there was widespread panic. The media was fueling it because it's very good for ratings. Politicians were scared because they are these days held accountable for everything that happens within their borders. They didn't want anybody to die, and because they were afraid that they would get in trouble for it. Then you had these highly speculative epidemiological models coming out of one place, the Imperial College in Rome, in London, from Neil Ferguson, that was predicting, at least in the US, 2.2 million deaths. And it made similar predictions all over Europe and the UK. Very importantly, these predictions were predicated with policy recommendations. You know, if there's legally enforced social distancing, then the deaths will go down. So the politicians began to panic, and they're like, forget constitutional rights, forget our traditions of liberty and law, forget letting people make risk assessments for themselves. Let's have a central plan for all of Europe and all of the UK and all of the US, and then Australia and New Zealand and so on, and Brazil and Latin America. So just within the course of something like 4 days, we threw out every important principle of Western liberty, all because of a perfect storm of media frenzy, predictive models, and political risk aversion. And boom, we decided to try out this terrible plan on the world. And as a result, of course, the world's in a depression. I would say that's not really the right word. The word is suppression. We're in a great suppression globally, and fortunately now opening up. So what is the lesson that we can draw from this? I do think that the most important thing you can turn to is the works of the Austrian economists in the 20th century. I mean, particularly the works of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, among many, many other great thinkers. They lived through socialism, fascism, Nazism, central planning, welfare state, the rise of the total state from World War I all the way to World War II, and Vietnam War, and so on, and seeing that the terrible thing that governments do to their societies. And there's several conclusions they came to, and I think in this case I would point to Hayek in particular. Hayek never tired of pointing out that the knowledge necessary to manage the good life and have a coordinated, free society is not available in its totality to anyone in particular, no single intellectual, and certainly no statesman. This was his theme. It was the knowledge problem, and he always recommended decentralized decision-making because it can adapt to circumstances of time and place, and it allows people to exercise their own intelligence and their own best interest and coordinate with others, and then social institutions to develop that, spread that knowledge out throughout society, rather than overriding those decision-making processes with a central plan. So everything we did in this crisis contradicts everything Hayek had written about. We, I think, know now that the right approach, we don't know this yet, but we're discovering this, that the right way to approach disease mitigation in the event of a pandemic is to have decentralized solutions. Vulnerable populations need to isolate. Nursing homes need to prepare for it. Schools need to understand, who the non-vulnerable populations are and respond in kind. Businesses need to be able to make the decision: should we stay open or should we close? And I'm not saying I have the answers to this. Should you wear a mask? Should you not? I don't have the answers to these things. That's why, and nobody does, and that's precisely why we need to leave this to the forces of society rather than politicizing the disease. 2 days ago, I ran an article by the great economic theorist Peter Boettke, and he said we should use this pandemic to understand the difference between humility and arrogance. What kind of arrogance? The political arrogance that thinks that politicians can be smarter than a virus, or that borders matter more than infection, or that predictive models can account for all the variables in human nature enough to establish an exact picture of what the future looks like with a cause and effect of models of how to affect that future. It's just untrue. And the arrogance to think that that people with guns know better than individuals themselves. Individuals don't want to be sick and they like to work with medical professionals. We have a medical industry that's here to mitigate disease and deal with it. No central plan works. So that's exactly what we did. We had this flatten the curve and social distancing models and reduce the pressure on hospitals and so on. It's very difficult to get that calibration between those two things right, even if it's correct. It's ultimately a cockamamie theory, and we all paid very heavy price for it in terms of high unemployment and despair, and suicide hotlines are going crazy. Alcoholism and drug abuse has gone through the roof in the last 6 weeks. So it's been a period of profound despair. In addition, it's really the saddest thing to me that many people in the course of the last 6 weeks have lost hope in the future. They wonder, what does our future look like when states can just shut your business down, can kick you out of school, can separate you from your family, can shut down travel? It's like all the things we took for granted, the right to craft our own futures and to travel and to make decisions that are wise for ourselves, all got ripped away from us overnight. And I think it's going to take a very long time for people to recover a sense of confidence. I think it's going to seriously hurt capital formation. We've had every central bank in the world cranking up the money printing presses. That liquidity has got to be sopped up over the next couple of months, or we're going to be facing tremendous distortions. Every government in the world has blown the budget. They're putting people on tremendous amounts of welfare, which is disincentivizing people coming back to work. This is going to be a very difficult recovery. What I want to emphasize here is that as bad as the virus is, the response has been more socially destructive than the virus itself. We took a problem and added another layer of problem to it. So we have a virus, then we added an egregious centrally planned regime almost all over the world. And now we've got to deal with both problems instead of just dealing with one problem. I'm concluding now, but point out something to you. Back in early March, Yale University released a very beautiful plea to stop the lockdowns. Don't lock down society. Don't disrupt people's lives. Don't violate human rights. Don't throw people out of work. Poverty is the worst killer. It's a worse killer than viruses. This letter put out by Yale University Medical School, or one of the faculty members, was signed in the United States by 800 medical professionals, begging governments to please do not do exactly what they're planning to do. The politicians went ahead anyway. And it was a terrible tragedy. And I hope we learn from it. I think this is a good way to think about this crisis. It's been a calamity for the world. On the other hand, for the last 20 years, maybe 30 years, we've turned away from the philosophy of freedom in any case. We put down human rights. The left and the right, we're pursuing socialism and nationalism in every country and central planning. We've become enraptured with the idea that intellectuals backed by state power with enough resources can bring about the perfect society. Well, we've just had a test in real time and it failed. So now is the time to revisit the philosophy of individual rights, human freedom, and liberalism, classically understood, in light of the works of the great liberal tradition, stretching from Peter Bethke all the way back to Adam Smith and before. I think this is the job of the Austrian Economic Center, to become a force in Europe for educating people. It's not enough that people understand that this whole thing has failed, which it has. Now it's the time to embrace what works, and what works is human freedom. So I'll leave my remarks there and open it up to questions.
Thank you, sir. If I could understand your point completely, would you hold this as an absolute principle, or you could consider that there would be a point in history or any other virus where these political solutions would be acceptable? Like if this virus would be more deadly, for example.
Well, so here's the problem with that solution. I don't think there's any conditions under which states know more than we know. And the problem with giving the power to governments is that they presume that they're smarter than us. And I don't see that that's true. The second problem with giving power to states to manage a pandemic, no matter how bad it is that they don't want to let go of that power afterwards. They act in their own self-interest. They use the crisis to steal your money and spend it on their friends, to violate your rights and upset our fundamental liberties. So I think it's too great a risk. I mean, first of all, number one, it doesn't work. But number two, it's too great a risk to take with fundamental institutions. So that's the point. In other words, my argument against lockdowns is not really contingent upon the severity of the disease itself, even though I think it was wildly exaggerated to whip up public fear. Even if it were as bad as the worst predictions were, I think society is smarter than states, and we can deal with this better than the political order. And you give up so much knowledge and intelligence and adaptability and flexibility when you turn over disease mitigation to governments rather than letting serious professionals, individuals deal with it on their own terms.
Why then do you think so many people who over the years seem to be quite consistent or on their classical liberal positions support the lockdown today?
You know what? You know, I'm sorry, I'm pausing at that. I think the answer is that for a lot of people, they hadn't really considered this before. They hadn't considered a pandemic disease before. It just really hasn't been an issue. It's not been anything that impressed upon anybody intellectual. And if a problem hits you, suddenly overwhelms you, you hadn't really thought about, you know, you can have a difficult time applying your principles to it, especially if it's happening in the midst of a panic. So, you know, there was just about 3 or 4 days there in which we went from being worried to being locked down. And I think it really disoriented a lot of people. We hadn't really thought about it. Now, I wrote my first article on this topic back in 2000. Look, I'm not an expert on this. I don't want to claim I am, but I have been thinking about this a long time. I wrote about this topic for the very first time in 2005. You know, do we need the state to take over our lives in the midst of a pandemic? And I watched the whole thing unfold in 2005 with the I think it was called the bird flu back in those days. And I concluded in my article that the answer is no. So then I wrote about it again 10 years later, and I wrote about it again in January. In fact, it's very interesting. I think it was about 4 years ago, I was at this conference in Las Vegas called Freedom Fest. And I was debating this guy named, very interesting guy, he's a good friend, Mark Skousen. And we were debating the old question, do we need a government or should we have a limited government, or what should we do? What can freedom accomplish and how can it be improved by the state, and all these kind of essential issues. And of course, I'm taking the pure freedom position, and he was taking the, well, I don't know, I think we need the government. And in the course of the debate, he said, well, the number one reason we need a government is in the event of a pandemic. He actually said this. This is maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I argued against it during the lunch thing, and then I lost the debate because he had a very effective. That was, to the audience, the most effective argument. Yes, we should have freedom and human rights and freedom of association, unless there's a pandemic. In which case, then we need mandatory quarantines and so on. And they voted against me because they thought that he had a very compelling point. Well, Mark Skousen, of all people, wrote me about 3 weeks ago and said, you know what? You were right. We gave government the quarantine power, the management of the pandemic, and look what a huge catastrophe they've made. I've changed my mind completely. You were correct. We should have let society manage disease. So that made me happy.
Well, there is a question from anonymous attendee. You guys are free to post your questions either in chat or under Q&A button. So this guy is asking, is this the end of USA, the economic crisis with massive unemployment and 10 trillion, we didn't see that, Fed printing? So let me wrap it up like in more general way. What is your short-term and long-term prediction for maybe not society per se, because it's more difficult to predict, but the economic situation of, well, let's say USA?
I always thought that the American empire would end in a similar way to the British Empire, that it would stop being the global center of the universe and become a normal society, just like what happened to Britain after World War I. I think this might be our moment for that to happen. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it necessarily means we're going to be economically less strong. I think there's still more wealth in the United States than any other country in the world. So it's all good. But in terms of leadership in the world, I think this has been a big blow to the U.S. I mean, the response in this country has been chaotic beyond belief. From Dr. Fauci, the advisor to Trump, he keeps flip-flopping. I mean, you can go back and read his articles from February 27th when he was saying this is just a mild flu, and then he became a top advocate of lockdown. The policies, and Trump himself, going from not caring at all, which was a mistake, to then imposing a travel ban, which everybody agrees is completely ridiculous, accomplished absolutely nothing to ban travel from Europe. I mean, that was crazy. And Australia and the UK, none of it made any sense. And then he began to advocate liberation from lockdown. Then he got scared again and started condemning governments state governments that were opening up, saying, "Oh, it's too soon." How does he know when it's too soon? I mean, I don't know if it's too soon or not. I don't know, but it's certainly Trump doesn't. Certainly Fauci doesn't. So American leadership has really discredited itself. That's my sense, that the U.S. has really pursued terrible policies in this. And what's interesting about this, you as an Austrian and me as fascinated with Austrian theory and the history of free markets and freedom ideology, is that we're fascinated when governments promise one thing and deliver something completely opposite. So I've been thinking recently about Trump's campaign promise in the most recent election to make America great again. And now look what's happened. So it's the best example I can ever think of as the reverse policies from what was promised. I don't think we're going to experience hyperinflation, if I'm guessing. I think the Fed will manage this way out of this. I think our debt is going to be terrible and it's going to be a drag on the economy. We've lost the confidence. I think capital formation is going to be a very long time, and it's going to be a year or 2, 5 before people starting businesses with confidence again. And we're going to experience a lot of unemployment for about the next 6 to 8 months, because people are making more money staying at home than they are going to work. And people are going to change careers from non-essential jobs to essential jobs. So there's a tremendous amount of disruption in the United States. So I was asked the other day on television, somebody said, what states have won from this? Like who's won the great COVID-19 struggle? And another guy on the show said, "Oh, the US is great." I don't think so. I think the winners out of this are South Korea and Sweden, Israel, because they opened up a lot faster than anybody else did. And I think those are going to be our winners. Maybe Singapore, and it's hard to say it, but China. I don't agree with China's policies on this, but they opened up as soon as they possibly could, obtained that herd immunity, and things seem to be rocking and rolling there. So I think those are the winners. I'm especially as proud of South Korea. I had just visited there about 2 years ago, and I knew for sure this country could never lock down. There's no chance in the world that they could have locked down South Korea. And in Sweden, an advisor to the government on their policy had a very interesting comment. They said, "Why didn't you consider lockdown?" And he said, "Well, the first problem is that would have been illegal in Sweden. You can't just shut businesses and put people under house arrest. That's not allowed."
Since you mentioned China, recently, White House policy seems to be to shift away American economy a bit from China. So what are your thoughts on this deglobalization, which is for sure going to happen, either in this sense of White House policy or in a more general sense? And what about this decoupling economies? What do you think about the thoughts of shipping supply lines from China? There is a comparative advantage in labor. So if we ship it to other countries or back to home countries, back on security issues, what's going to happen?
It's going to introduce a tremendous number of inefficiencies and higher prices and tremendous disruptions in industry. So it cannot help us. In ways that are invisible, we're going to pay a huge price for this. But Trump's war on China goes back now 4 years. I mean, he came into office promising a war on China. He's got it. With the tariffs, which Americans pay, he keeps claiming that China pays them. They don't. Your tariffs for imports are paid by domestic producers, not by foreign governments. It's completely crazy. So he wants to decouple the U.S. from China. But the important thing to understand Trump's outlook on this is that he's what's called in history an autarkist. Like, he thinks that all production must be national. The problem with that is that fundamentally violates the division of labor. It means that everything has to be made in one country, which would be tremendously disruptive and actually impoverishing. And so if Trump really still imagines that this is going to be the case, it's going to severely reduce American growth and cost consumers extremely heavily. I've been against this war on China from the beginning. Whether it's the war, the arrest of the Huawei executive in Canada at the U.S. bequest, or the demand that U.S. Telecommunications companies not use technology from China for 5G. I mean, I think all this stuff is just crazy, paranoid, nationalistic, and really catastrophic. We've had a growing trend until Trump got into office. The US was the world leader in free trade. It began after World War II with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and came all the way to the World Trade Organization. Tariffs have gone down, 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 down. At the same time, prosperity has gone up and up and up and up. And this has been the greatest blessing for the world. Really, the trend began following the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1932. It began the trend toward free trade started flipping in the other direction in 1934. After World War II, it really advanced, and we've been making nonstop progress. And Trump just overnight, with a bunch of demagogic populist rhetoric, reverse that. And I can't predict what the results of this are, but they're not going to be good.
John Galt, I don't know who is he, but he asked the question, and he noticed that you did not mention the hyperinflation possibility to happen. Fed balance sheet is now 6.6 trillion US dollars. Why Jeffrey Tucker didn't mention it? Probably he didn't have time. So do you have some comment on that?
Well, let me just say, I think it's possible. It's always possible. I mean, Weimar never expected to destroy the Reichsmark back when that happened. So, hyperinflation, no government that enacts hyperinflation policies fully expects what's going to happen. So this could happen in this country. There's a couple of factors that I think are really important here. The first one is a purely technical point. The velocity of money in light of a crisis like this really falls, which is to say that savings goes very high. People hold on to their cash. They get very risk averse. They're going to be spending much less. Okay, so that's the velocity of money. And if you understand something about the basic truism of the equation of exchange, if velocity goes way down, that reduces a lot of pressure on prices. So, that's a deflationary tendency that happens under those conditions. The more risk averse people are, the more it's not inflation that becomes a threat, but deflation. Now, it's true that if the Fed leaves all this hot money on the streets, and the velocity starts increasing again and business loans start going out, and banks start lending to business to make up for the calamity over the last 6 weeks, which they're certainly going to have to, and nothing else changes on the part of Federal Reserve policy, and they don't try to sop up some of the liquidity they've created, yes, it will generate, obviously, inflation or even hyperinflation. But I kind of doubt that the Fed will permit this to happen. And the reason I say that is that after 2008, they bailed out the entire banking system, but then they also paid banks to keep their reserves on deposit with the Fed more than they could earn from lending them out, which massively tamped down the rate of creation of money. Now, they believe that was an awesome thing to have done, and they feel like they fixed the crisis for us out of 2008. So that is now, I think, the new policy. And I'm just purely guessing that within the next month or two, the Fed's going to start enacting those same kind of policies, and that they will arrest the tendency towards hyperinflation, which is not to say they'll succeed, but I think that's going to be the attempt in any case.
Don't you think this, apart from hypothesizing if free libertarian societies could handle the epidemic better. Do you think this situation may be a good opportunity to, after a year or two, compare the solutions made by various countries and to make some conclusion that, hey, look at actually Hong Kong or Liechtenstein or Singapore, Monaco, which used to be, I mean, we used to think they are the closest to libertarian ideal today, but they did some form of lockdown and they do well economically. What conclusions could we have afterwards?
Well, I wish we had some case somewhere, an advanced developed nation that pursued like zero policies at this at all, with the exception of the availability of testing, which is to say, there would have been testing anyway. The World Health Organization was sending tests all over the world. So the US blocked them. So that's a lot of the reason for the chaos in this country. But I wish we had at least one case where they had not banned mass gatherings, let business make their own decisions, let some conventions go ahead, others crack down, some theaters open, others not, some sporting events happen, others not. Like a pure example of a liberal approach somewhere in the world. I think that if we had seen that, we would have seen that one country emerges better than any other. So we don't have that, but we do have South Korea and Sweden. And I think, with the exception, it's like they both made mistakes, right? They neither of them were perfect. But I think in general, I think those models are going to prevail. And I think it's just really interesting that the World Health Organization is already saying that Sweden should serve as a model for the future. So we're going to be looking at that. The other thing is that even in the US, you know, it's been a little bit weird. We've had a centralized solution for things like foreign travel and these nightly press briefings and this kind of stuff. But for the overwhelming majority of policies have been left to the states. And we found out that we have a lot of tyrants at all the states, but not all. So there's some states that never closed down. South Dakota never closed down. And some other lockdowns were actually not that severe. And what statisticians have discovered is that there's no difference in the transmission or death rates or the case fatality rate in the country, in the states that locked down versus those that didn't. The difference is that the states that didn't lock down are still have happy people without personalized trauma, didn't violate their human rights, the domestic abuse is down, and so on. So they've fared better overall economically and in terms of human rights than those that locked down. So yeah, these studies are going to be done all the time. Which actually, let me just raise another point about this. The weird thing about what we've gone through the last 2 months, and you know this, and everybody watching knows this, we have the most amazing torrent daily of data hitting us, of every kind of data, from tests to case fatality rates to infection rates to unemployment rates and production. It's like we're being slammed with these mountains of data. It's not making us smart, it's actually kind of making it stupid. On the other hand, it does give a chance for researchers to get out there and actually examine the data and perform these good experiments. And I think under these conditions, the freedom's going to fare really well. There's a very interesting study that came out from the National Bureau of Economic Research about 3 days ago from 3 MIT economists who are cranking through all this data, and you're welcome to download the paper. It's actually fascinating. What they said was that we've done no good for anybody in locking down non-vulnerable populations, canceling schools, restaurants, and so on, when we should have been having policies focused on isolating the vulnerable populations and the sick, which is what would happen in freedom anyway. That's what, if we had done nothing, that's precisely what would have happened. I guess that's my main point. Freedom has the capacity to intelligently solve a crisis on this level. And I think the social scientists are going to gradually come to this conclusion looking at the data.
Well, but looking at the data, all these scientists, social scientists, they didn't come to conclusion when I look at the mainstream opinion about superiority of liberalism. I mean, full liberalism, let's say, in the world. And Eleonora asks the question, which follows up your point, because I think what a lot of libertarians are worried about is that after the event, there will be not only bigger prerogatives of governments, of control, of closing borders, or checking people who they travel to, what they buy, where does it come from, but also that social support for these ideas of anti-globalization and control and more government intervention will be higher. So after the event, what we as liberals, what the story should we tell to the people in 5 or in 10 years in order to convince them to trust and support human freedom instead of this more government intervention, considering that there is huge support worldwide to political intervention already, and there perhaps could be more after?
I think we believe that there's widespread support for these lockdowns because that's what the pollsters tell us, but I don't think you can trust a single one of these polls. If in the middle of a pandemic and a lockdown where the police are arresting you for going to the park, and a pollster calls up and says, what do you think about the lockdown? I think your first response is going to go, yeah, I think it's okay. You know, so I don't actually trust these polls. I think there's actually a tremendous amount of anger. I can't speak to Austria or the European case, although I suspect it's similar. In the United States, there is everybody's just absolutely scandalous. I don't know any exception to this. Like people that were initially okay with the lockdown, about 2 weeks in began to think this is insane. We have a constitution for a reason. Whatever happened to human rights? Why do we do this? If I get COVID-19, I'm probably gonna be okay according to the demographics. I'm worried about my grandmother, in which case I probably shouldn't go visit her, but I can make intelligent decisions for myself. I think that there's going to be a huge backlash against the government planning and apparatus here. I think this is a scandal for the ages. I really do. And but yes, you're right. We have to engage in a little bit of education here too. I think people are ready for the message. And the message should be that the lockdown was a mistake. I think that's what, and we have to show it, and we have to believe it. We have to explain how a free society could have managed the pandemic better than the states, and everything that the governments did actually made things much worse. This is going to become increasingly obvious over the next coming months and years. I think the world's more disposed to hear the liberal message than ever before. There's going to be a backlash against imperial politicians presuming dictatorial rights over their legislatures where they never asked them. It's just because you happen to be in charge that makes you the best medical doctor and to know what all society should do. Give me a break. The regulations that have inhibited testing and cures and made it difficult for doctors to serve across borders, those are all going away. The regulations that have stopped medical professionals from dealing with patients through the internet, those have been largely gone away, repealed in the US just out of necessity. Here's another very interesting thing. I'm not sure what happened in Austria, but in the US, we have a lot of people who school their children at home, but they've always been a little bit under a cloud, like people have not liked them that much, because we have these laws for universal compulsory schooling and the preference for everybody going into public schools. And then just overnight, all those schools were shut down. Suddenly homeschooling became mandatory, you know? So it's going to be very difficult after this for people to say, oh, you have to force your kid back into these schools, since we've already gone through 6 weeks of basically universal homeschooling. Other things are going to change, like childcare regulations. People are desperate to have a place so they can go back to work to put their children, but childcare is unbelievably regulated in the United States. So all those regulations have to go. There's going to be a lot of big changes. The open office is probably going to go away. You know, a lot of things are going to change going forward, and a lot of it is going to be backlash against what really is an undemocratic and dictatorial response on the part of governments all over the world. Look, human beings do not want to live in cages. They will not live there for very long. And if you understand something about the human spirit, our desire to be innovative, creative, and manage our own lives, then you can see we're going to see a refurbishment and a renewal of liberalism in the coming months and years.
Well, you always seem to me a very optimistic person, but now it's even more. Joe Ferramoska asks the question. You can guys ask your questions in chat or under Q&A button. His question is, Neil Ferguson has warned of calamity in previous pandemics as he did with COVID-19 and failed. What will governments go by if there is a future episode?
Well, I don't think it's going to be Neil Ferguson. I mean, his model is very interesting. What happened to him, what he did is he cobbled this together this very alarmist model based on a model he'd been using for years, written in C++. So he hadn't even updated the model in light of modern technology. The same model that predicted calamity with mad cow disease, mad sheep disease, avian flu, bird flu. Going back like 20 years, he keeps recycling this model. And it just so happened that this time he brought it to the parliament, and everybody found it compelling and thought he was the great wizard who knew everything. But in the last several weeks, he's been under a tremendous amount of pressure to release his code. And it's been released in bits and pieces on GitHub. And when you apply that his same model to countries like Sweden, it predicts vastly more death than Sweden had. I can't. Phil Magnus has written an article about this at American Institute for Economic Research. You have to look it up. I can't remember the numbers, but it's not predictive at all. So he said, if there's no lockdown, then you're going to face this mass death, and that didn't happen. So I think Neil Ferguson, who's a physicist, by the way, not an epidemiologist, and certainly not a medical doctor, is going to have to answer for a lot of things. Yes.
Well, definitely seems like society now is in a very vulnerable state on getting information, on changing their opinion. And now we should act as educators probably stronger than afterwards, because you say that, yeah, after we can convince people with data and see that lockdown wasn't necessary. But in the meantime, probably a lot of new regulations will be coming, and it will be more difficult for us to make an argument for free society than we used to have. And with epidemic, the argument is even weaker. What do you think we should worry then the most? I mean, of course, I could frame the question like, should you worry more the virus or the government? But maybe there's some particular characteristic of the society that we should be worried about.
Well, even from the very beginning, like I can just tell you from early March, when you could feel the drumbeat for controls coming, I was far more concerned about the government than I was the virus itself. And of course, the media narrative was to flip that. The government's your savior, the virus is your enemy. I was like, the virus is a problem, but government's going to make it much worse. So that is the overwhelming message, but I just don't think that's going to stick. Here's the thing, from a liberal point of view, people are looking for answers right now. And people want to believe in human rights and freedom of association. And so they're looking to liberal intellectuals and liberal organizations to point the way out of this and to explain how society works without this kind of brutal impositions and central planning that has proven not to work. So I think it's going to be up to us. And I would say, for the first time in my life, we have a vast audience now hungry for these perspectives. I mean, I can just tell you, our traffic at American Institute for Economic Research is like out of control. I mean, like we're getting, we're almost at 2 million views, I think, already for this month alone. I've never seen anything like it. And yes, like also people criticize you. And it can get brutal. I mean, you know how Twitter works and so on, but you can't be afraid of Twitter. I mean, I'm sorry, Twitter is not violent. It's just people being trolls and being annoying and questioning some of your data or taking you to task on this or that. And maybe you're wrong, maybe you're right, but you shouldn't be afraid. Don't be afraid to speak your mind. As long as it's balanced and it's calm and it's humane and it makes sense, which I can't say that's always been true for everything I've written, by the way, but that's the ideal. I think we can win this battle because people are listening. But my message here is like, don't be afraid to speak. Like be bold, show moral courage, rally around what's true. Actually, more important than that, go back and revisit the great works. I think it's good to reread Hayek right now. Road to Serfdom, Use of Knowledge in Society. Go back, Law, Legislation, and Liberty. Like spend some time with the great works, Adam Smith. And gain intellectual confidence right now about this position. Don't say anything you don't believe, but if you believe it, don't be shy to say it, because you can make a difference. Like, you have to ask yourself, what is it that wrecked the world over the last 6 weeks? Virus is bad, but this lockdowns and central planning and travel bans and violations of human rights are far, far worse. So if you understand that, then just ask the reverse question, what's right? The reason why governments took over was because we didn't have a good, I would say ultimately the answer is we didn't have a good culture of freedom, a good solid intellectual understanding of the value of freedom going into this. Well, coming out of this, it's going to be up to us to help educate ourselves and to spread this knowledge in the general population, and we can make a difference for the next time, because right now people are listening. Now's the time to read, get smart, act, and speak. We can make a difference.
So if you had hold the world attention for 30 seconds, and those people who doubt what should be the response, where should the society go, how should I vote, how would you, like, how do you provoke them to reach out for better knowledge, to look rationally at the world and come up to good conclusions? What would you tell to this whole world population in your 30 seconds? Read Mises or check data?
I would say in the first place, trust your own volition and your own judgment more than those people who are trying to make judgments for you. I think almost everybody over the last 6 weeks has felt frustrated that they've not been able to exercise their own judgment in a good way and manage their lives in a good way. They have not appreciated the lockdowns. Most people I know would tell you that they could have done this better, and they can list terrible things. I was cut off from my grandmother. My children were trapped in Europe. You know, you name it. People have so many terrible, and just ask the question, do you think that you could have managed your life better if the governor, if the government, if the state had not cracked down on you? I think the answer is yes. Now, if that answer is yes for you, let's make that answer yes for everybody. And what is a system in which everybody can exercise their own judgment, intelligent, informed judgment about how to handle pandemic? That system is called liberalism or freedom.
Well, there is a lot of unanswered questions in the Q&A section, but I can see that people also feel you're a bit too optimistic, and they worry, for example, about the spike in people needing intensive care units. So they are afraid of virus. They're afraid of more difficult viruses to come in the future. They're afraid of vast audience hung on some very progressive media and being cowered into submission for many years to come. People are worried about China exploiting economic crisis to strengthen their influence in Africa. They're afraid of Joe Biden winning the election. I would like to ask you 6 separate questions about it, but there is not much more time. Maybe you would like to comment on some of them that I mentioned.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm scared of Joe Biden. I'm also scared of Donald Trump. I'm scared of all these guys. I'll tell you just in the near term, and I'm not speaking as a medical expert, but I listened to a long interview from Michael Levitt, who's this Nobel Prize-winning chemical biostatistician and chemist. And he's very concerned about this problem that you mentioned, that with liberalization, you're going to get more exposure and more death and drive up the case fatality rate, and then a panic, and they're going to shut it back down again. I don't think that's an illegitimate concern. I think it's a serious issue. And he named in particular the problem of Australia, because like, Australia is very different from Austria. In Australia, they have very low infection and very low death. And they're proud of this. And they're saying, well, that's because we locked down. Okay, well, a virus is not, it's not just a thing that gets bored, or you can ban from a country and it gets bored and it goes somewhere else. That's not the way viruses work. So it's possible you're going to see, once liberalization happens, vast rates of infection and new rates of death, and that's going to panic the media and the politicians. Whether they can get away with a second level of lockdown, I'm not entirely sure, but I am actually concerned about that. I'm concerned about that in the US too. I think this is actually the biggest concern I have, is that in 2 or 3 months, again, we're going to lock down. So that is a legitimate concern. I have to tell you, we have to wait and see. But I think people have been very patient for 6 weeks in the course of this. And at some point, people are just going to say, look, I have to live a life. I have to have my future back. Viruses are terrible, but we're gonna deal with them in the context of freedom and human rights. I'm not entirely sure that even if there's a media panic, that they're going to be able to get away with the second round of lockdown. I actually seriously doubt that. In terms of the politics, look, my own hope is that every single politician in the world who has favored lockdowns, whether it's in your mayor or your prime minister or your president or the governor, is going to get unseated by somebody who runs against this failed, embarrassing, and heavily destructive policy. It's very possible, I think it's possible, that the main thing we're going to experience coming out of this is a complete, peaceful political revolution. I think it's possible. And I base that in part on history. Japan after World War II, Germany after World War II. It's possible we won't experience a ratchet effect here, as Higgs talks about, but actually the reverse, like a complete blowback against what they've done to us. That's my hope. It's even slightly my expectation. Maybe I'm wrong, but let's wait and see.
I hope you are right. Personally, I have 3 simple bets. When I will send you New Year's wishes next year, if we survive this all, I'm gonna check your answers. On 31st December 2020, who's gonna be president of the United States? What's your prognosis?
I think it will be Trump. I think it would be a bloodied and humble Trump, but it'll be Trump.
What about the US economy? Let's say Dow Jones. How many points?
I think the stock market's probably going to rise between now and the end of the year and probably obtain its old highs, and if not get beyond them, actually. So I'm not so worried about the financial markets going forward. The US economy, though, is going to be very high unemployment, 20% or more, unless we do something about the unemployment benefits. And we will be in a very deep recession for probably another 18 months to 2 years.
Would you like to make any prediction about state of the lockdown? If there would be any lockdown still in the US, if maybe no lockdown, but bigger control prerogatives of the government?
I don't think there will be a lockdown, but there's going to be a lot of excuses made for more surveillance, more disease surveillance and contact tracing and nationalization of our cell phone information and that sort of thing, because governments love nothing better than to spy. And if they can scare everybody into giving them data, they're going to do that. So, and there's also a possibility that we're going to have mandatory vaccines, which could potentially be catastrophic, actually. I have an article about that this morning at AIER that you should read. It's actually pretty alarming. So there's some very bad things. I'm not like a Pollyanna. Like I know bad things can happen. I think one good thing that's going to happen is that we're going to discredit the politicians, and that's good. But that still doesn't do anything about the problem of the deep state. Yeah.
I'm gonna check these bets on the New Year's.
Okay.
But I hope in the meantime we will meet either here on Zoom or on any offline events if they are possible.
That would be ideal. Yeah, well, let's open up travel again. That's really urgent. We need to get travel going again. Absolutely.
Absolutely. You can guys travel to Vienna like you did now online. This was Free Market Roadshow Vienna edition, hosted by Austrian Economic Center and the Hayek Institute and Centrum Kapitalizmu Poland. Our guest was Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. Thank you, everybody, for attending this and listening to us. You can check this video or recording on Facebook of Austrian Economic Center. Thank you, sir, for joining us and saying so many interesting and wise and good hopes, hopefully, things. Take care,
I enjoyed it.
guys. Wash your hands. Bye-bye.